Story 1. I was 9 years old. The first time I found a human tooth on the trail behind my house, and my father slapped it out of my hand so hard that I fell into the leaves, then dragged me home without saying a word. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that when I woke up the next morning, there were 7 teeth lying neatly across my bedroom windowsill, all facing the same direction, pointing toward the mountain. And 23 years later, after becoming a park ranger, I was sent back to that exact Appalachian town to investigate the disappearance of 6 hikers, 3 local residents, and a ranger who had radioed dispatch at 2:13 in the morning and said, "The people in the town are walking into the woods again," before screaming for 41 seconds straight. The town was called Little Greer, a tiny, forgotten place in the Appalachian Mountains with 1 gas station, 1 church, a closed-down elementary school, and fewer than 200 people. And I hadn't returned since I was a child because my father had moved us away without explanation after my mother disappeared during a walk near the mountain. But when my supervisor handed me the case file, I saw a photograph of the missing ranger and felt my stomach drop because his name was Daniel Voss, the same man who had found me crying beside the trail when I was 9 years old. The same man who had told my father, "You need to get the boy out of this town before it learns his name." And I remembered my father hitting him in the mouth before throwing me into the truck and driving away. I arrived in Little Greer just before midnight, and the first thing I noticed was that nobody had curtains in their windows. Every house was lit from the inside, and behind nearly every piece of glass stood a person facing the mountain, completely motionless, as if the entire town had been watching something in the trees for hours. I drove slowly down Main Street, and although I recognized the old church and the rusted water tower, everything looked smaller than I remembered, almost shrunken, but the silence was exactly the same. No dogs barked, no insects made noise, no televisions played behind the windows. My radio crackled, and dispatch asked me to confirm my location. "Little Greer," I answered. There was a pause. "Unit 7, repeat." I repeated it. This time my supervisor came on the channel. "Turn around." I asked him why. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "There are no residents in Little Greer." I laughed because I was literally looking at them. "I'm watching people through their windows right now." His voice became strained. "Hale, Little Greer was evacuated in 2001. I stopped the truck. "What?" "There was a chemical spill after a mine collapse," he said. "The town was condemned. Nobody has legally lived there for 25 years. I looked toward the nearest house. An old woman was standing behind the window. The moment I looked directly at her, she slowly raised 1 finger to her lips. Then she pointed behind me. I turned toward the rear window of my truck and saw a little boy sitting in the back seat. I spun around so fast I nearly hit the steering wheel, but the seat was empty. When I looked outside again, the old woman's house was dark. My radio went dead. I got out and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and something metallic. The furniture was covered in dust, but there were fresh footprints across the floor. Bare footprints. Small ones. They led into the kitchen, where I found a plate sitting on the table with 7 human teeth arranged in a circle. I didn't touch them. I backed away, and that's when I heard someone whisper my childhood nickname from the hallway. Nobody outside my family had called me that since I was 9. Little Greer boy. My flashlight swept across the wall. Empty. Little Greer boy. This time, the voice came from inside a closet. I walked toward it, telling myself it could be a trapped resident, maybe one of the missing people. But as soon as I put my hand on the knob, something on the other side knocked 3 times. I stepped back. Then the door slowly opened by itself. There was nobody inside. Only an old ranger uniform hanging from a hook. Daniel Voss's uniform. His badge was still attached. Beneath it, written on the wall in something dark and dried, were the words, "He brought you back." I ran outside and headed for the ranger station at the edge of town. But when I reached Main Street, every person had come out of their homes. They were standing silently along both sides of the road facing me. Old men, women, children. People I remembered from childhood, except none of them looked any older. I recognized the man who owned the gas station when I was a boy. He had been at least 50 back then, yet he looked exactly the same. Then I saw my mother. She was standing beneath a street lamp in the dress she had been wearing on the day she disappeared. I stopped breathing. "Mom?" Her face slowly turned toward me. Her eyes were wet with tears. She mouthed one word: "Run." The church bell rang. Every person in the street disappeared. Just gone. The town was empty again. I heard a scream from the mountain and immediately recognized Daniel Voss's voice. I ran toward the trailhead without thinking. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe some part of me had been waiting 23 years to go back. The old trail was exactly where I remembered it, beginning behind the abandoned school and climbing toward a ridge locals used to call Widow's Peak. I found fresh boot prints in the mud. Ranger boots. Daniel's. Beside them were 6 sets of hiking prints, 3 barefoot adult prints, and dozens of small footprints that appeared and disappeared randomly, as though children had been walking in circles. About half a mile up the trail, I found the first hiker. At least, I thought it was a hiker. He was sitting against a tree with his back toward me. His backpack was still on. "Sir?" I called. He didn't move. I approached and placed my hand on his shoulder. His entire body collapsed forward. There was no head. The neck ended in a smooth, dark surface, but his hands were still gripping something tightly against his chest. I pried his fingers open and found a child's shoe. My shoe. The exact brown shoe I had been wearing in an old photograph taken a week before my mother disappeared. I dropped it and ran. Behind me, someone began laughing. A child's laugh. Then my mother's voice called from the trees, "Don't leave me again." I stopped. I knew it wasn't her. I knew it. But then I heard her crying, and the sound was so real that I turned around. Standing between the trees was my mother, except the lower half of her body was buried in the ground as if the earth had swallowed her to the waist. Her arms reached toward me. "Please," she whispered. "It hurts when it moves." I took one step toward her. Then Daniel Voss grabbed me from behind and dragged me to the ground. "Don't look at the faces!" he shouted. He looked terrible. Thin, filthy, blood covering one side of his head. "What the hell happened to you?" I yelled. He didn't answer. He pointed toward my mother. She was gone. In her place stood a tall figure wearing my ranger uniform. Its back was turned toward us. "That's why you never come home," Daniel whispered. I asked him what it was. He looked at me with pure terror. "Little Greer isn't a town anymore. It's bait." He told me that after the mine collapse, people started hearing voices beneath the ground. Miners claimed they heard their dead relatives calling from tunnels that had been sealed for decades. Then children began disappearing. The ones who returned were different. They knew things they shouldn't know. They spoke about houses underground and streets beneath the mountain, where people stood outside all night waiting for someone to bring them a new face. Daniel said the government evacuated the town after dozens disappeared, but some people refused to leave because they claimed their missing family members had come back. "They did come back," he whispered. "Just not all of them." I asked why I had been sent there. Daniel stared at me. "You weren't sent." I grabbed his jacket. "My supervisor assigned me this case." He shook his head. "No, you called it in." My radio suddenly came alive. Dispatch was transmitting a recording. My voice. "Dispatch, this is Hale. Send me to Little Greer. I know where the missing people are." I stared at Daniel. The recording continued. "I'm bringing my mother home." I had never said those words. Daniel grabbed my arm and started pulling me downhill. "It knows you're remembering now." Something massive moved beneath the earth. The ground split open ahead of us, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. Warm lights glowed below. I heard the sound of an entire town. Cars, voices, a dog barking, music playing somewhere far underground. Then my mother called my name. Not from the woods, from beneath the mountain. Daniel began screaming at me not to go down, but I pushed him away and descended. I wish I hadn't. At the bottom was Little Greer, not a ruined town, a perfect town, larger than the one above, with every building brightly lit and hundreds of people walking the streets. I saw all 6 missing hikers sitting on a bench. I saw the 3 missing residents standing outside a store. I saw Daniel Voss. Another Daniel Voss. Clean, smiling, wearing a brand new uniform. Then I saw myself. A younger version of me was standing outside my childhood home. My mother opened the front door. She looked normal, alive. She smiled at the child version of me and held out her hand. "Come inside." I suddenly remembered everything. When I was 9, I hadn't found a tooth on the trail. I had followed my mother into the woods after hearing her call me. We had entered the mountain together. My father and Daniel had found me alone the next morning, but I wasn't supposed to remember what happened down there. Something grabbed my shoulder. I turned. My mother was standing behind me. Her smile was gone. "You were the only one who escaped," she whispered, "and it has been waiting for you to come back." Every person in the underground town stopped moving. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. Then, all at once, they began removing their faces. I don't know how else to describe it. They lifted the skin from their heads like masks, revealing darkness underneath, and beneath that darkness were more faces. Missing hikers, rangers, children, my father. Daniel screamed from somewhere above me. I ran toward the staircase, but it was gone. The town lights shut off. Something huge began breathing beneath the street. My mother's voice whispered from every direction. "You left me here." I found a narrow tunnel and crawled through it, hearing footsteps behind me, dozens of them, followed by my own voice begging me to stop. I crawled until I saw daylight and burst out onto the mountain just as dawn began. Search teams were surrounding me. My supervisor was there. He looked shocked. I asked where Daniel was. My supervisor went pale. "Daniel Voss?" I said yes. He told me Daniel had been dead for 23 years. His body had never been found. I asked about the 6 hikers. He told me there were no missing hikers, no missing residents, no case. I showed him my assignment on the computer in my truck, but the screen was blank. Then he handed me my radio. "You've been missing for 3 days," he said. "We found your truck at the Little Greer trailhead." I asked why nobody told me the town was abandoned. He stared at me. "We did. I went home that evening and locked every door. I threw away my boots. I burned the old photograph of my mother. I refused to look toward the mountain." At 2:13 a.m., my radio turned on. Daniel Voss came through the static. "Don't answer the door." I froze. 3 knocks sounded from downstairs. Then my mother called, "Honey, "I'm home." I didn't move. Another 3 knocks. Then my father's voice. "Open the door." We found her. I covered my ears. The 3rd knock came from inside my bedroom. I slowly looked toward the closet. The door was open. 7 human teeth were lined across the floor, pointing toward me. Then something whispered from the darkness, wearing my own voice. "Little Greer never wanted your mother." And from downstairs, my mother began screaming as if something was tearing her apart. "It wanted you to come back, old enough to remember the way home." Story 2. I was holding a dead little girl's hand when she squeezed mine back, and that was how my first night in the Appalachian town of Mercy began. I had been sent there to search for a family of 4 who vanished on an old mountain trail. But by the time I arrived, the sheriff's office was locked, the streets were empty, and every clock I could see in every house window was frozen at exactly 2:17 a.m. The town sat deep in a narrow valley surrounded by black mountains, the kind of place where the trees seemed to climb halfway up the sky before disappearing into fog. And I remember thinking I had never seen a place look so dead while still having every porch light burning. Dispatch had warned me that the case was unusual. The missing family had arrived in Mercy that afternoon, rented a cabin, and gone for a short walk on a trail called the Mother's Mile. They never returned. Their car was still parked at the trailhead. Their cabin door was open. Dinner was sitting on the table. But the strangest part was the emergency call made by their youngest daughter. She was 8 years old, and dispatch had recorded her whispering, "The lady under the trail says my mommy is already dead." Then the line went silent. I arrived shortly after midnight and parked beside the town's old church. I called dispatch to report that I was beginning the search, but all I heard was static. Then, underneath the static, a little girl began humming. I turned off the radio. The humming continued. It was coming from outside my truck. I stepped into the street and saw a child standing beneath a street lamp. She wore a yellow raincoat and was holding a doll by one leg. Her head was lowered. I asked if she was okay. She didn't answer. I asked if she'd seen the missing family. Slowly, she raised her face toward me. Her skin was grey. Her eyes were open, but they were completely white. "You're late," she whispered. I took a step back. "Who are you?" She looked toward the mountain. "They've been waiting for a ranger." Then she walked into the darkness between 2 houses. I followed her, and that was my first mistake. The alley ended behind an old funeral home. The girl was standing beside a row of wooden steps leading underground. I asked her what was down there. She smiled. "The town before this one." I told her to come with me. She reached for my hand. Her fingers were freezing cold. Then she said, "Don't let go." I almost pulled away, but something about her frightened face made me hesitate. We started down the steps. The air became colder with every step until I could see my breath. At the bottom was a tunnel lined with old photographs. Families, weddings, school classes, rangers. Every photograph had been damaged, as if someone had scratched the faces away. Then I saw one photograph that hadn't been touched. It showed a young girl in a yellow raincoat standing beside her parents. The girl whose hand I was holding. I looked at the date beneath the photograph. 1969. My heart stopped. The girl looked at me. "That's me." I asked her name. "Emma." I asked how old she was. She thought for a moment. "I was 8. I let go of her hand. The moment I did, every light in the tunnel went out. In the darkness, Emma screamed, You let go! I ran blindly toward the stairs, but the tunnel had changed. There were doors on both sides now, and behind every door someone was crying. I heard the missing mother begging for help. I heard the father shouting his daughter's name. I heard the little boy from the family screaming, "Mommy doesn't have a face anymore." Then I heard something much worse. My own voice. "Don't open the door, Hale." I stopped. I had never been inside that tunnel before. At least I didn't think I had. My flashlight flickered on. One door stood directly in front of me. My name was carved into it. I touched the handle. Behind me, Emma whispered, "That's where you were buried." I spun around. She was gone. The tunnel was empty. I should have run, but I opened the door. Inside was a small room with dirt walls and a wooden chair. Someone was sitting in it. A ranger. His back was toward me. I recognized the uniform immediately. Ranger Michael Rourke. Missing for 17 years. "Rourke?" I whispered. The man slowly turned around. His face was normal, but his mouth had been sewn shut. Tears ran down his cheeks. He pointed toward the floor. I looked down. Human fingernails were scattered across the dirt. Hundreds of them. Some were fresh. I stepped backward, and Rourke suddenly stood. He grabbed my arm with unbelievable strength and pulled me toward the wall. Behind him, a child's voice began counting. 1, 2, 3. At 3, something beneath the floor knocked once. Rourke began shaking his head violently. The voice counted again. 1, 2, 3. This time, the floor knocked 3 times. Rourke pushed me toward the door. I ran into the tunnel just as something exploded through the floor behind me. I didn't look back. I heard wood breaking, Rourke screaming through his sewn mouth, and something crawling after me on too many hands. I reached the stairs and burst into the funeral home. Mercy was different now. The town was full of people. Every street was crowded. Men and women stood beneath the porch light, staring toward the mountain. Children held hands in the road. I saw the missing family among them. The father, the mother, the 2 children. The youngest girl saw me and started crying. "Ranger!" I ran toward them. "Come with me." The father grabbed his daughter's shoulder. "We can't." I asked why. He looked at his wife. She slowly turned toward me. Her face was gone. Just smooth skin from forehead to chin. The little boy screamed, "That's not my mommy!" The church bell rang once. Every person in the street covered their ears. The girl in yellow appeared beside me. Emma. "It's waking up," she whispered. I asked what was waking up. The ground beneath Mercy began to shake. Windows shattered. A crack split the middle of Main Street. Warm air rushed upward from beneath the town, carrying the smell of soil and something rotten. The townspeople began walking toward the crack. One by one, they climbed down. The missing family followed them. I grabbed the youngest girl, but the father pulled her away from me. "Don't take her from us again," he said. I asked what he meant. He pointed at Emma. "You already did that once." I looked at Emma. She was crying. "He doesn't remember," she whispered. Then my memory came back. Not completely. Just enough. I had been in Mercy before, years ago. When I was a trainee ranger, I had joined a search for a missing child. Emma. We had found her yellow raincoat beside the trail, but never her body. That was when Ranger Rourke disappeared. I remembered hearing something under the ground. I remembered a hole opening beneath the trail. And then, nothing. Emma took my hand again. "You promised me you would come back." I stared at her. She pulled me toward the church. Inside, hundreds of names were carved into the pews. Missing residents. hikers, rangers. At the altar was a photograph of me in my trainee uniform. Beneath it was written, "He left her here." I backed away. Emma whispered, "You ran." I told her I didn't remember. "It took the memory," she said. "It lets people leave if they forget who they abandoned." The church bell began ringing without stopping. The doors slammed shut. Beneath the floor, something enormous began moving. The missing mother appeared at the end of the aisle, faceless, dragging 1 foot behind her. The father was behind her. Then the children. The youngest girl looked at me and whispered, "Please don't let Mommy take us underground." I grabbed Emma and ran toward the back door. It opened into the mountain. There was no town outside anymore. Only forest and a trail descending into darkness. My radio turned on. Dispatch was calling me. "Hale, get out of Mercy!" I shouted into the microphone. "Where is Mercy?" The dispatcher went silent. Then she said, "You tell me. You've been asking that for 4 days." I froze. 4 days. I looked at my watch. It still said 2:17 a.m. Emma pulled my hand. "We have to go." We ran through the woods until we reached the trailhead. My truck was waiting there, covered in mud. I started it and drove without looking back. In the mirror, I could see Mercy shrinking behind me. The church. The houses. The people standing in the streets. Then the whole town vanished behind the trees. At dawn, I reached the ranger station. My supervisor was waiting outside with a group of deputies. He ran toward me and opened the passenger door. "Where's the girl?" he asked. I looked over. Emma was sitting beside me holding her doll. "She's right here." My supervisor stared at the empty seat. "Hale, you're alone." I turned toward Emma. She smiled sadly. Her hand was still holding mine. I looked down at our fingers. Her skin was grey, cold, dead. I screamed and pulled away. She vanished. My supervisor handed me an old case file. Emma's photograph was inside. The same yellow raincoat, the same white eyes. Cause of death, presumed buried in a mountain collapse, 1969. Then he opened another file. My trainee report from years ago. I had been assigned to search for a missing girl in Mercy. The report ended with one sentence written in my handwriting. I found her under the trail, but I left her there. I stared at the page until I noticed a second sentence beneath it. The ink looked fresh. "Come back, Ranger. You still owe me your hand." I threw the file away and went home. That night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., I woke because someone was standing beside my bed. I didn't open my eyes. Then I felt a small freezing hand close around mine. Emma whispered, "This time, don't let go." And from underneath my bedroom floor, the entire town of Mercy began ringing its church bell. Story 3. I was still chewing my breakfast when the missing woman's eye rolled out of my Park Ranger radio, and for several seconds I just stared at it lying on my desk, wet and blinking, while the radio continued playing her voice from somewhere inside the static, whispering, "Please don't tell them where you found me." I know that sounds impossible, and if someone else had told me this story, I would have assumed they were lying or losing their mind. But I had been a ranger in the Appalachian district for 11 years, and by then I had learned that the worst calls never came from the mountains themselves. They came from the towns at the bottom of them, from places where people had spent generations learning exactly which questions not to ask. The woman whose eye had somehow appeared in my radio was named Clara Wynne, 32 years old, a school teacher from a small town called Blackbriar. She had disappeared the previous night while walking home from a community meeting. Her husband reported hearing her scream from the edge of the woods, then finding her purse lying in the road with both shoes placed neatly beside it. By morning, half the town was searching for her, but nobody had entered the forest. They were all standing around the trailhead, staring into the trees. When I arrived, the sheriff pulled me aside and said, "You can search if you want, Ranger, but don't follow anyone who calls you by your childhood name." I asked him what he meant. He wouldn't answer. Then I looked at the trees and heard a woman's voice say the name my mother used when I was a child. I had not heard that name in over 20 years. I walked into the woods anyway. Clara's trail was easy to follow at first. There were drag marks in the leaves, broken branches, and blood on the bark of several trees. Then everything stopped at an old stone wall deep in the forest. There was no house behind it, no road, no building, just the wall, standing by itself beneath a mountain ridge. Someone had written across the stones in red, "We are open again." I radioed the sheriff, but instead of his voice, Clara answered. "Don't come over the wall." I asked where she was. "Below it." I asked what that meant. She began crying. "They said you were the one who would find me." Then the radio went silent. I climbed the wall. On the other side was Blackbriar, not the modern town I had just driven through, but an older version of it. Dirt roads, wooden houses, horse carts, smoke rising from chimneys, people in old clothes walking silently through the street. I turned around. The stone wall was gone. I was standing at the edge of a town that should not have existed. A little boy ran past me holding a newspaper. I grabbed it. The date was October 1914. Then I heard Clara screaming. I ran toward the sound and found her standing in the middle of the road. Her clothes were torn, her face covered in dirt, and one side of her face was bleeding heavily. "Where's your eye?" I asked before I could stop myself. She covered the empty socket. "They took it so I could see." I didn't understand. She pointed toward the mountain. "Don't look at the windows." Every house in the town had dark windows. Behind each one, something was moving. I grabbed Clara's arm and told her we were leaving. She shook her head. "We can't go back over the wall." I asked why. She looked down the road. A group of people was walking toward us. At first I thought they were townsfolk, but they were carrying old lanterns and wearing expressions so blank that I knew immediately something was wrong. Clara whispered, "They don't have eyes." The people lifted their faces. Their sockets were empty black holes. One of them spoke. "The ranger has arrived." We ran. Clara led me through an alley and into an abandoned schoolhouse. Inside, children's desks were arranged in perfect rows. On every desk sat a glass jar. Each jar contained an eye. Hundreds of them. Some were fresh. Some were cloudy and ancient. Every eye was open. Every eye was looking at me. Clara began shaking. "They made me choose one." I asked her what she meant. "They said if I took an eye, I could see the door home." I grabbed her hand and searched the room. At the back was a black door with a brass handle. I opened it. Behind it was a classroom filled with missing people. Clara's husband, several hikers, 2 deputies, an old ranger I recognized from a decades-old missing person poster. They were sitting quietly at desks, facing the blackboard. On the board was written, "Today's lesson, how to come back wrong." The ranger turned toward me. His eyes were gone. He whispered, "Close the door." I slammed it shut, just as something inside began pounding against it. Then the school bell rang. Every glass jar shattered. Eyes rolled across the floor. Clara screamed. One of the eyes stopped beside my boot. It was the eye from my radio. It blinked and looked up at me. Then it whispered my name. We ran outside. The town was changing. Buildings were rotting around us, transforming from the clean old town into burned ruins. The eyeless people were everywhere now. They stood in doorways, on rooftops, at the end of streets. Clara dragged me toward the church, saying there was a way out beneath it. We entered through the basement. A tunnel descended into darkness beneath the church. Along the walls were thousands of photographs showing missing people from different years. Each photograph had a date. The dates continued into the future. I found mine. It showed me standing beside Clara, holding my radio. The date beneath it was tomorrow. I tore the photograph from the wall, but another one appeared. This time I was alone. My eyes were gone. Clara grabbed my shoulder. "They're coming." We heard footsteps above us. Slow and heavy. The eyeless townspeople had entered the church. We ran deeper into the tunnel until we reached a wooden door covered with handprints. Behind it, someone was crying. Clara whispered, "That's my daughter." I asked what. She told me her daughter had died 3 years earlier. The voice behind the door called, "Mommy, open it." Clara reached for the handle. I stopped her. She screamed at me to let her go. The little girl's voice began crying harder. "Mommy, I can see you now." Clara collapsed. I understood then. The town gave people what they wanted to see most. Dead children, missing spouses, lost parents. But every gift came with a price. Clara suddenly looked at me. Her missing eye was back. "I can see the way out." She pointed toward the tunnel behind me. I turned and saw daylight. We ran toward it. I could hear the townspeople behind us. Clara was ahead of me when she suddenly stopped. A little girl stood at the exit. Her daughter. Clara smiled and walked toward her. I shouted for her to stop. The little girl raised her face. Her eyes were black holes. Clara screamed. Hands came from the darkness and pulled her backward. I grabbed her wrist, but something pulled harder. For a second, I was holding Clara's hand while she was being dragged into the dark. Then her hand came off in mine. I fell backward onto the grass outside the stone wall. The modern forest was around me again. The sheriff and search team found me 30 minutes later, unconscious and covered in blood. Clara was missing. I told them about the old town, the schoolhouse, the jars, the eyeless people. Nobody believed me. The sheriff became pale only when I mentioned the date, 1914. He showed me an old newspaper article about the original Blackbriar settlement. In 1914, the entire town had vanished overnight. 43 people disappeared. Their houses were later found empty, with jars containing human eyes on the school desks. The place was burned down and rebuilt years later. The stone wall was all that remained. I returned to the ranger station and tried to write my report, but my radio kept turning on. Clara was whispering through the static. I found the way back. I asked where she was. No answer. Then she said, "Don't look at me." I heard footsteps outside my office. I looked through the window. Clara was standing in the parking lot. She looked normal. Both eyes were there. She smiled. I went outside. "Clara?" She slowly raised her face. Something moved behind her eyes. Dozens of tiny shapes pressed against the skin from inside, trying to escape. I stepped back. She whispered, "They came with me." Both of her eyes burst open. I ran inside and locked the door. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, people in Blackbriar have started disappearing again. Every night, another window appears in my house. I don't know where the windows lead. I covered the first one with plywood, but the next morning there were two. Behind the glass, I can see the old town. The eyeless people walk through the streets holding lanterns. Clara stands at the end of the road smiling. And last night, for the first time, I saw myself standing beside her. He turned toward the window. His eyes were gone. Then he lifted one hand and wrote something on the other side of the glass. I read it before the words faded. You found the eye. Now they can see you too. Story 4. I was called to a mountain trail at 3:06 in the morning because someone had found a human ear nailed to a tree. But when I arrived, the ear was gone, and my own voice was whispering through the forest. Don't come any closer, over and over again. The call came from the small Appalachian town of Ash Creek, a place so isolated that the only road into town passed through 12 miles of dense forest and a narrow stretch of mountain where cell service disappeared completely. A local hunter had called the sheriff after finding the ear beside an abandoned trail called Widowmaker Path. And because the trail crossed protected land, I was sent as the nearest park ranger. By the time I arrived, the hunter was gone. His truck was still parked at the trailhead, engine running, driver's door open. But the only thing left behind was his flashlight lying in the mud and a trail of bloody fingerprints leading into the trees. The sheriff wasn't answering his radio. Dispatch couldn't raise him either. I should have waited for backup. But somewhere ahead of me, a woman began screaming for help, and the voice sounded so close that I ran into the forest before I could think. The trail was narrow, covered with wet leaves, and after less than 5 minutes, I found the tree. A long, rusted nail had been hammered into its trunk at eye level. Something dark was dripping beneath it, but there was no ear. Instead, there was a small plastic evidence bag hanging from the nail. My name was written across it. Inside was one of my ranger patches, old and faded, from a uniform I had thrown away years earlier. Behind me, something whispered, "You found it last time too." I spun around. Nothing. Then my radio crackled. My own voice came through clearly. "Hale, turn around." I didn't. "Hale, please." The voice began crying. "Don't let me see it again." I switched off the radio and kept walking. That's when I noticed footprints in the mud. A man had been walking ahead of me. Ranger boots. My size. My tread pattern. The tracks were fresh, and they led deeper into the woods. I followed them until they stopped beside an old wooden sign that read, Ash Creek Cemetery. I had worked this district for years and had never heard of a cemetery there. Beyond the sign, the trees opened into a clearing filled with gravestones. Every stone had the same date of death. October 31st, 1988. I walked between them, reading names, men, women, children, entire families. Then I found my name, Ranger Hale. The date was today's date. I stepped backward and bumped into someone. An old man was standing behind me. His face was covered with a burlap sack. He held a hammer in one hand and something small and bloody in the other. "You're early," he said. I drew my weapon and ordered him to drop it. He laughed. "That's what you said before." I asked him who he was. He lifted the sack slightly. Underneath was nothing but darkness. I fired a warning shot. The sound echoed through the clearing, and every gravestone began knocking from underneath. Once, twice. Then hundreds of hands burst through the soil. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached the trail, but the forest had changed. The trees were closer together, and the path had become a road leading into Ash Creek. The town was fully lit, even though it was nearly 4 in the morning. People stood outside every house. None of them moved. I drove through the center of town with my doors locked, but the people turned their heads as I passed. At the end of Main Street, I saw the sheriff standing beside his patrol car. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I stopped and shouted his name. He didn't answer. I stepped out. "Sheriff?" He slowly turned around. Both of his ears were missing. Blood covered his collar. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then he pointed toward the mountain. I heard the church bell ring. Every person in town covered their ears. The sheriff grabbed my arm and shoved me back into my truck. He wrote something on the fogged windshield with his bloody finger. "Don't hear them." I looked at him. Then the whispering began. Hundreds of voices came from the mountain. My mother. My father. Missing hikers. Dead rangers. All calling my name. I covered my ears, but the voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside my head. "Hale," they whispered. "We remember what you did." I drove toward the ranger station, but every road led back to the cemetery. The burlap-faced man was waiting beside my grave. This time, dozens of people stood around him. Their ears were gone too. He lifted the hammer and pointed at me. "The mountain doesn't want your body." He tilted his head. "It only wants you to listen." The ground beneath my truck split open. I jumped out as the vehicle disappeared into darkness. I ran into the cemetery. One of the graves had opened. Inside was a body wearing my uniform. I leaned over it. The face was mine. Older. Dead. Both ears missing. A small radio was pressed against its chest. It turned on. My voice whispered, "I told you not to come closer." I dropped it. The burlap-faced man began walking toward me. I ran between the graves until I found a stone building hidden behind the cemetery. An old ranger outpost. The door was unlocked. Inside, newspapers covered the walls. Every article described disappearances in Ash Creek. At the center was a photograph from 1988 showing a group of park rangers standing at the trailhead. One of them was me. I was wearing the same uniform. I stared at the date. I hadn't been born yet. Beneath the photograph, someone had written, "He always comes back when the mountain calls." Then I heard the woman scream again. The same scream that had brought me into the woods. It came from beneath the floor. I pulled open a hatch and found a staircase descending underground. At the bottom was a room filled with radios. Hundreds of them. Every radio was broadcasting a different voice. Some begged for help. Some screamed. Some whispered names. I found the hunter's radio. He was still alive. "Ranger, please," he cried. "I'm right behind you." I froze. A warm breath touched my neck. I turned. The hunter was standing there smiling. His ears were gone. "You took too long," he whispered. Then something grabbed me from behind and dragged me through a doorway. I fell onto wet earth. The mountain was above me, but I was underground. A huge tunnel stretched ahead, and the walls were covered with ears. Human ears. Thousands of them nailed into the stone. Some were fresh. Some were old. And every single one was whispering. I ran through the tunnel until I found the sheriff sitting against the wall. He was alive. Barely. He grabbed my jacket and whispered, "Don't let them cut yours off." I asked who was doing this. He pointed deeper into the tunnel. The people of Ash Creek. I didn't understand. He told me the town had made a deal generations ago. Every year, when the mountain began whispering, someone had to give it something that could hear. If they didn't, the whispers would enter every home and drive the residents insane. Rangers were perfect because we always came when people disappeared. "And the missing people?" I asked. He began crying. "They're the ones who try to leave." Suddenly the whispers stopped. Total silence filled the tunnel. The sheriff looked terrified. "Run!" We ran toward a crack where moonlight was visible. Behind us came the sound of a hammer striking stone. Once, twice. Then the burlap-faced man called, "Ranger Hale, you still owe us your ears." The sheriff shoved me toward the exit. I crawled outside and rolled down a slope. When I looked back, the tunnel was gone. The sheriff never came out. By sunrise, backup teams arrived. I told them everything. They searched Widowmaker Path, but there was no cemetery, no underground tunnel, no old outpost, and no sign of the hunter or sheriff. The official report said both men were missing. I requested a transfer immediately. I left Ash Creek that afternoon. I thought it was over until I reached a highway outside the mountains. My radio turned on. The static was louder than usual. Then my own voice whispered, "You can leave the town." I gripped the steering wheel. "But you can't leave the listening." I switched off the radio. The whispering continued through the speakers, then through my phone, then through the car vents. Finally, directly beside my left ear, the burlap-faced man whispered, "Hold still." I pulled over and jumped out of the truck. I stood alone beside the highway. No one was there. Then I felt something warm running down my neck. I touched my ear. Blood. I rushed to the truck mirror. Both ears were still there. But behind my reflection, someone was standing in the back seat. The sheriff. He was smiling now. His ears were back. He leaned forward and whispered, "You finally heard us." That night, I woke up in my apartment because my pillow was wet. I thought it was sweat until I saw blood. I touched my head. My ears were gone. On the bedside table, nailed neatly beside my ranger badge, were 2 human ears. Mine. And from somewhere inside the walls, hundreds of voices began whispering the same thing at once. "Welcome to Ash Creek." Story 5. I found my own body hanging from a tree at the end of an Appalachian trail, and the worst part was that it was still alive. Because when I stepped closer, the thing wearing my face opened its eyes and smiled at me. The call came from a tiny mountain town called Red Hollow, a place hidden between steep Appalachian ridges where fog sat in the valley so thick that locals said you could walk into it and disappear before taking 10 steps. A group of teenagers had gone hiking on a trail called Dead Man's Run, but only one of them returned. He came running into town barefoot and covered in blood, screaming that his friends had been put back in the trees. Before collapsing, he told the sheriff that a ranger had taken them. The problem was I was the only ranger on duty that night, and I had never met the teenagers. The sheriff called me while I was driving toward Red Hollow. "Hale, don't let anyone see your face," he said. I thought the radio was breaking up. "What?" "Cover it, and if you see yourself, run." The signal died. I reached the town around 1 a.m. and immediately noticed that every mirror in every shop had been covered with newspaper. Even the windows of the diner were painted black. A woman standing outside the gas station saw me step out of my truck and began crying. She covered her child's eyes and pulled him away from me. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It knows you're here." I asked what she meant, but she ran inside and locked the door. The sheriff's office was empty. His patrol car was outside with the engine running, but the keys were still in the ignition, and there was blood on the driver's seat. I found a note on his desk written in shaky handwriting. "If he asks which one of you is real, don't answer." Then my radio turned on. A man's voice said, "Ranger Hale, I found the kids." It was my voice. I stood completely still. "Where?" I asked before thinking. The voice laughed. "At the end of the trail." I should have waited for backup, but one of the teenagers might still have been alive, so I drove to Dead Man's Run. The trailhead sign had been scratched so badly that the original name was almost gone. Someone had carved another sentence beneath it. "Don't let the other you get home." I followed the trail with my flashlight and found the first backpack hanging from a branch. Inside was a phone playing a video. I pressed play. The screen showed 4 teenagers walking through the woods. The camera turned toward a 5th person. Me, wearing my uniform. I was walking behind them. The teenager holding the phone asked, "Are you really a ranger?" The version of me in the video looked directly at the camera and smiled. Then the recording ended. I ran deeper into the forest. A few minutes later, I found the second teenager. He was standing between 2 trees with his back toward me. I called out. He turned around. His face was covered with strips of bark. Blood ran from underneath. He pointed behind me. I spun around. Nothing. When I turned back, the boy was gone. I heard branches cracking overhead. Then something dropped from a tree. A body. I jumped back and shined my flashlight upward. My own body was hanging from the branch. Same uniform, same boots, same scar above the eyebrow. A rope was tied around its neck. The body slowly raised its head. Its eyes opened. "Took you long enough," it whispered. I couldn't move. It smiled. "Help me down." I ran. Behind me, the rope creaked as the thing climbed down. I heard my own footsteps following me. Not similar footsteps, identical. Every time I stepped on a branch snapped behind me at the exact same moment. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I ran. They ran. I finally reached an old wooden bridge crossing a deep ravine. On the other side stood the sheriff. I shouted his name. He waved me over. "Quick!" I ran halfway across before he shouted, "Don't look down!" Of course, I looked. Under the bridge, dozens of bodies were hanging from ropes tied to the beams. Some were teenagers, some were hikers. Several were wearing ranger uniforms. All had my face. One of them opened its eyes, then another. Then all of them began smiling. The bridge broke beneath me. I grabbed a plank and pulled myself onto the other side. The sheriff grabbed my arm and dragged me into the woods. "We have to get you underground," he said. I asked why. He told me the thing in Red Hollow could copy anyone it saw, but it preferred rangers because rangers had authority. People trusted uniforms. "How do we kill it?" I asked. The sheriff looked at me. "We don't know which one you are anymore." I pulled away from him. He raised his weapon. That's exactly what the other one said. The sheriff's radio suddenly crackled. My voice came through. "Sheriff, he's lying." I looked at the sheriff. He went pale. The voice continued. "I'm the real Hale. Don't let him take you underground." The sheriff backed away from me. I told him not to listen. Then the trees behind us began moving. Something stepped out. Me. The other me. He looked perfectly normal now. No rope, no wounds. He held up his hands. "Sheriff." "Thank God." The sheriff looked between us. "Which one of you is real?" Neither of us answered. The sheriff began crying. "No," he whispered. "That's what the note meant." Then the other me smiled. The sheriff fired at him. The bullet hit a tree. The other me had disappeared. I turned toward the sheriff. "Run!" But the sheriff's face suddenly changed. His skin stretched. His features rearranged. Then he became me. There were now 2 of us standing in the woods. I backed away. The copy laughed. You thought I only copied faces? I ran until I reached a clearing with an old fire tower. The door was open. Inside, dozens of photographs covered the walls. Every photograph showed me in red hollow at different times. Some were dated years before I had ever worked there. In one photograph, I was standing with my father as a child. In another, I was wearing a uniform I had never owned. At the center was a photograph taken tonight. It showed me entering the tower. Behind me, the copy was standing in the doorway. I turned. It was there. "Who are you?" I asked. It tilted its head. "Who do you think?" I pulled my knife. It laughed. "I remember everything you do." I asked what it wanted. Its smile disappeared. "To leave." The tower began shaking. Outside, the forest was filled with people. The missing teenagers. The sheriff. Town residents. Every one of them had my face. They surrounded the tower, staring upward. The copy stepped closer. "I've been under this mountain a long time," it whispered. "Every ranger who comes here gives me another memory, another voice, another way to walk among you." I asked why it hadn't left already. Because I needed someone to take my place. I attacked it. We crashed through the tower doors and rolled down the hill. For several seconds, I couldn't tell who was who. We punched, kicked, and grabbed at each other's uniforms. Then I felt a knife enter someone's chest. The other me gasped. I pulled away. He stared down at the blade. "Good," he whispered. "Now they can tell us apart." He collapsed. The crowd disappeared. The forest became silent. I stood over the body until backup arrived at sunrise. They found me sitting beside the trail, covered in blood. The body was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. The sheriff was still missing. The teenagers were never found. I returned to headquarters and tried to convince myself I had survived. Then my supervisor asked why I had changed my uniform. I looked down. I was wearing an old ranger uniform, not mine. The name patch read Hale, but the first name was different. I checked my ID. It wasn't in my wallet. My phone didn't recognize my fingerprint. I drove home and stood in front of my bathroom mirror. My reflection looked normal. I smiled. It smiled. Then I stopped smiling. My reflection didn't. I backed away from the mirror. It leaned closer. Behind its reflection, dozens of people with my face were standing in the bathroom. The sheriff was among them. One of the missing teenagers, too. Then the reflection pressed its hand against the glass and whispered, "You did kill one of us." I asked what it meant. The reflection smiled wider. "But you never found out which one." I haven't slept since that night. I avoid mirrors. I keep every light on. But yesterday, my supervisor called and said someone had reported seeing me on Dead Man's Run. I told him that was impossible. I was at home. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Hale." "That's not the problem." I asked what was. He whispered, "The man on the trail says you're the copy." Last night I heard knocking on my front door. 3 slow knocks. I looked through the peephole. I was standing outside. He was smiling. He leaned close to the door and whispered, "Open up. I just want to see which one of us gets recognized." Story 6. I knew something was wrong with the little girl before she ever spoke to me, because she was standing alone at the entrance to an Appalachian mountain trail at 2:41 in the morning, barefoot in the freezing rain, holding a severed finger in one hand and a park ranger badge in the other. And when I asked her where her parents were, she looked up at me with a smile and said, "They're under the trail with the others." I'd been working the district around a small Appalachian town called Briar's End for almost 6 years, and I knew every official trail, every hunting road, every abandoned logging path, and every family that still lived in those mountains. But I had never seen that little girl before. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her yellow dress was soaked black with rainwater and mud. Her feet were bleeding from cuts, and her hair was stuck across her face, but she wasn't crying. That was what bothered me most. Any normal child alone in the woods at that hour would have been terrified. This girl looked relieved to see me, as if I was exactly who she had been waiting for. I crouched beside her and asked her name. She stared at me for several seconds before answering, "You know my name." I told her I didn't. She opened her small hand and showed me the ranger badge. The name engraved across it belonged to Ranger Ellis Ward, a man who had disappeared near Briar's End 12 years earlier. I asked where she had gotten it. She pointed up the trail. "He gave it to me before they took his mouth." I stood up so quickly that my knees cracked. I radioed dispatch and asked for backup, but the radio filled with static. Then a man's voice whispered through the speaker, "Don't let her take you down." It was Ellis Ward. I had heard recordings of his voice during training. I looked at the girl. She was still smiling. "He lies now," she said. "They made him." I asked her who they were. The girl pointed toward the mountain. "The town, under the town." I wanted to put her in my truck and leave immediately, but when I reached for her hand, she stepped backward. "You have to find my parents first." I asked where they were. "Under the trail." Then she turned and began walking into the forest. I followed her. I know I shouldn't have, but every instinct I had as a ranger told me not to abandon a child alone in the mountains, even if something about her felt wrong. The trail climbed steeply through the trees, and after only 10 minutes I noticed that there were no animal sounds anywhere around us. No rain hitting leaves. No wind. The forest had become completely silent, except for the girl's bare feet slapping against the mud. I shined my flashlight at the ground and saw her footprints ahead of me, but beside them were another set. Adult footprints. Then another. Then dozens. All of them were coming from the trees and joining her trail. I stopped. The girl stopped too. "Why aren't you walking?" she asked. I asked who had been following us. She slowly turned around. Her smile disappeared. "They're not following us." She pointed behind me. "They're following you." I spun around. Nothing was there, but my flashlight beam landed on dozens of human footprints surrounding me in the mud. None of them had been there a second earlier. I grabbed the girl and hurried forward. She screamed when I touched her arm, and for a moment I saw something beneath her skin move from her wrist to her shoulder like a snake crawling under the flesh. I let go. She stared at me angrily. "Don't touch me." I apologized and asked if she was hurt. She looked toward the mountain. "Not anymore." We reached an old wooden bridge crossing a narrow ravine. On the other side stood a sign I'd never seen before. Briar's End Municipal Trail. The sign looked decades old. Beneath it, someone had carved a message: "Do not bring the child back." I asked the girl what it meant. She whispered, "They wrote that after the first time." I asked what first time. She looked at me. "After you brought me back." My stomach tightened. I had never seen her before. "You're mistaken," I said. "I've never been here with you." She smiled again. "You don't remember?" My radio crackled. Dispatch suddenly came through. "Hale, return to your vehicle immediately." I asked them to repeat the message. My supervisor's voice answered, shaking. "Hale, you're not supposed to be at Briar's End." I told him I had been sent to search for a missing child. There was silence. Then he said, "There are no missing children. Briar's End was evacuated 17 years ago." I looked down at the girl. "Who are you?" I asked. She said nothing. My supervisor continued over the radio. "That town was buried after a sinkhole opened beneath the mountain. 83 people disappeared. We don't patrol there anymore." The girl suddenly screamed, "Don't listen to him!" Her voice changed as she screamed. It became deeper, layered, as if several people were shouting through her throat at once. The bridge shook beneath us. I looked down into the ravine and saw lights below. Houses, streets, cars, an entire town beneath the ground. People were standing outside their homes looking up at us. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. The girl whispered, "They're awake." The wooden bridge collapsed. I grabbed the railing and somehow pulled myself onto the far side, but the girl disappeared into the darkness below. I heard her crying, "Ranger, please don't leave me again." I almost climbed down after her, but then Ellis Ward's voice came through my radio. "She's not a child." I asked him what she was, the reason the town disappeared. I backed away from the ravine. Then I heard the girl calling from directly behind me. "Why did you leave me under there?" I turned. She was standing on the trail again, completely dry. Her yellow dress was clean. She was holding the severed finger against her chest. I asked where her parents were. Her face slowly changed. Her mouth stretched into a smile that was too wide. "I found them." She opened her hand. The finger was gone. In its place was a small human tooth. "Then I found their teeth." I ran. I didn't care where the trail went. I just ran through the forest until I reached the abandoned town. Houses stood empty along the road, windows broken, weeds growing through the pavement. I had never been there before, but something inside me recognized everything. I found the old elementary school and suddenly remembered standing outside it years earlier. A child screaming from beneath the ground. A rescue team digging. My supervisor shouting at me to stay back. Then the memory disappeared again. I walked inside the school. Children's drawings covered the walls. Every drawing showed the same thing. A little girl standing on a mountain while people fell into a hole behind her. In every drawing, the girl had no face. At the end of the hallway was a classroom door with my name written on it. I opened it. The room was full of old ranger uniforms hanging from the ceiling. Each uniform belonged to a missing ranger. Some were rotting. Some looked new. At the center hung my own uniform. My current uniform. I checked my body. I was still wearing it. I slowly walked closer. The uniform hanging from the ceiling began moving. A body was inside it. It lowered its head. My face looked back at me. Its lips were sewn shut. It held up a notebook. Written across the page were 3 words. "She remembers you." I heard footsteps behind me. The little girl was standing in the doorway. "They told me you would come back when you were old enough." I asked. "Who told her?" She pointed to the floor. Something beneath the classroom began knocking. Once, twice, 3 times. The entire floor cracked open. A hand came through. Then another. Dozens of hands. Children began climbing out of the darkness. They were covered in dirt and wearing old clothes. Some had no eyes. Some had no mouths. All of them stared at the girl. "Come home," they whispered. She began crying. For the first time, she looked like a real child. She grabbed my hand. "Please don't make me go back." I wanted to help her. God help me, I wanted to. But then I noticed something on her wrist. A faded hospital bracelet. My name was written beneath hers. "Patient." Unknown female. Responsible officer. Hale. The memory returned all at once. 17 years earlier, when I was a young ranger, I had been part of the first search after the sinkhole. We found a little girl alive beneath the town. We pulled her out. She kept screaming that everyone underground was still alive and begging us not to close the hole. But the mountain was unstable. Officials sealed it. The girl disappeared from the hospital 2 days later. I had forgotten her face, forgotten her name, forgotten the case. But she hadn't forgotten me. "You promised," she whispered. "You said you'd come back for the others." The hands were reaching toward us now. The children were whispering louder. I pulled the girl toward the exit. She stopped. "You can't take me." I asked why. She smiled sadly. "I'm not the one you rescued." The classroom lights flickered. Behind her stood another girl. Same face, same yellow dress. Then another, and another. Dozens of identical girls filled the hallway. I understood. The thing beneath the town had copied her. Or maybe it had copied everyone. The girl beside me whispered. I was the first. The copies began walking toward us. Their mouths opened. All of them spoke together. "Bring her back." I grabbed the real girl and ran through the school. We burst outside as the ground began collapsing beneath the town. The entire street split open. I could see the underground houses below. People standing in doorways, waiting. Ellis Ward was among them. His mouth was gone, but he raised his ranger badge toward me. I ran until I reached my truck. I threw the girl into the passenger seat and drove. Behind us, Briar's End disappeared into fog. The girl was silent for several minutes. I looked at her. "What's your name?" She looked out the window. "Lily." I told her we were going somewhere safe. She smiled. "You said that last time too." I drove faster. We reached the ranger stations just before sunrise. My supervisor ran outside and opened the passenger door. "Where is she?" he asked. I pointed. "Lily." He looked at the empty seat. My heart stopped. Lily was gone. On the floor was Ranger Ellis Ward's badge. I picked it up. On the back was a fresh engraving that hadn't been there before. "Return the first child." I refused to go back. I filed my report and transferred out of the district 2 weeks later. For months, nothing happened. And then one night I was sleeping when my bedroom door opened. I heard small bare feet walking across the floor. I kept my eyes closed. A little girl's voice whispered, "Ranger." I didn't answer. "Ranger, please." I felt something cold placed in my hand. A park ranger badge. Then the girl whispered, "My parents are still under the trail." I opened my eyes. Lily was standing beside my bed, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, filling the doorway, were dozens of identical girls in yellow dresses. And somewhere far below my house, beneath concrete and soil, and miles away from any Appalachian mountain, something enormous knocked 3 times from underground. Story 7. I should have known the trail was wrong when I saw a park ranger sign with my own name on it, because the sign was nailed to a tree, deep inside a section of Appalachian forest where no trail had existed for at least 30 years, and beneath my name someone had carved 3 words that made my blood turn cold. "You died here." The call came from the tiny mountain town of Hollow Creek, just after sunset. A group of hikers had reported hearing a man screaming from somewhere beyond an abandoned logging road, followed by what sounded like a child repeatedly saying, "He's coming back." By the time I reached the trailhead, the hikers were gone. Their backpacks were still sitting beside their vehicle, their phones were inside the truck, and the driver's door was wide open. I called their names into the forest, but there was no answer. Then my radio crackled. Ranger Hale! I froze. The voice belonged to a little boy. They're hiding from you. I asked who he was. I'm the one they left behind. I told dispatch I had possible survivors and entered the woods. The trail immediately felt wrong. The trees were too quiet, the air unnaturally cold, and every few minutes I heard footsteps matching mine exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. I finally turned around and shouted, "Who's there?" A man's voice answered from somewhere behind the trees. "You shouldn't have come back." I recognized the voice. It was mine. I continued deeper into the forest and found the first hiker sitting against a tree. He was alive, but his face was covered in mud and blood. He grabbed my sleeve and whispered, "Don't trust the ranger." I told him I was the ranger. He started crying. "No, not you. The other one." Before I could ask what he meant, something moved behind him. He stared over my shoulder and whispered, "He's here." I turned. A man wearing my uniform was standing between the trees. His face was hidden by darkness. He raised one hand and waved. Then he stepped backward and disappeared. The hiker screamed, "Run!" We ran toward the trailhead, but the forest seemed to stretch around us. After several minutes, I realized we had passed the same tree 3 times. Each time, a fresh message had appeared on its bark. The first time you ran, the second time you hid, this time you stay. The hiker suddenly stopped. "That's it," he whispered. "This is where he takes us." I asked who he was talking about. The hiker pointed toward a shallow depression in the ground. "You." The soil began moving. A hand pushed upward, then another. I dragged the hiker away just as a human body crawled halfway out of the earth. It was wearing my old ranger uniform. The face was mine. The body looked decades older, skin grey and stretched tight across the skull. Its mouth opened and my voice came out. "You forgot me." I backed away. The hiker screamed that we needed to leave. We ran until we reached a ruined ranger station hidden beneath the trees. The door was unlocked. Inside, dozens of old incident reports covered the walls. Every report involved missing hikers. Every report ended with the same sentence: "Search terminated after dark." I found a file with my name on it. The date was 28 years earlier, 3 years before I had joined the Ranger service. The report described a rescue operation involving a young boy who disappeared on the mountain. The boy's name was Daniel Hale. My name. I stared at the photograph attached to the report. It was me as a child. I had no memory of the incident. The final page contained a handwritten note. The boy came back, but he wasn't alone. The door behind me slowly closed. The hiker whispered, "You don't remember, because they took it from you." I asked him what they took. He pointed at my chest. "The part of you that stayed underground." Then every radio in the station turned on at once. Hundreds of voices filled the room. Some cried, some screamed, some begged for help. Then one voice became clear. My mother's. "Daniel, come home." I hadn't heard her voice in 16 years. I walked toward the radio. The hiker grabbed me. "Don't answer." My mother's voice became louder. "Daniel, I'm waiting." The floor beneath us began shaking. A trap door opened beneath the desk. Warm air rose from the darkness. I looked down and saw a staircase descending into the mountain. On the wall beside it were hundreds of children's handprints. The hiker whispered, "That's where they keep the ones who come back." We descended. At the bottom was a cavern filled with old camping equipment, shoes, backpacks, and ranger uniforms. Every missing person's belongings were arranged neatly in rows. At the center stood a wooden chair. A little boy was sitting in it. He looked exactly like me at age 8. He smiled. He finally remembered. I asked who he was. He said, "You." I shook my head. "I'm here." He pointed at the ceiling. "So am I." Then I heard footsteps behind us. The other ranger entered the cabin. He removed his hat. It was me, older, scarred, dead-eyed. "You were supposed to stay," I said. I asked why. He looked at the child. "Because the mountain needs someone to guide the lost." I asked what the mountain was. He smiled. "It isn't a mountain." The cavern began breathing. The walls expanded and contracted like lungs. The hiker dropped to his knees. "Oh God." The other me whispered, "It's awake." The child version of me stood up and walked toward the wall. "They've been waiting for you." Hundreds of faces began appearing beneath the stone, pressing outward as though trapped inside the mountain. Missing hikers, rangers, children. They were alive. Their mouths opened simultaneously. "Take his place." I ran. The hiker followed. We climbed the stairs while something chased us. I could hear dozens of bare feet striking the steps. We reached the ranger station and burst outside. The forest was completely dark. No moon. No stars. The hiker suddenly grabbed my shoulder. "Where's your shadow?" I looked down. There was none. His face went pale. "You're not the one who escaped." I didn't understand. He backed away. "You've been the copy this whole time." I looked at my hands. They were beginning to turn grey. The other me stepped out of the station behind us. "Now, you understand." The hiker ran, but the forest swallowed him almost immediately. I chased him until I reached the trailhead. My truck was gone. The road was gone. Hollow Creek was gone. Only the old trail remained. Then I saw the sign again. My name was still carved into it, but the words beneath had changed. "You died here." Again. I heard someone behind me. A little boy whispered, "Dad." I turned. My son was standing on the trail. I don't have a son. He smiled anyway. "You promised you'd come back." I stepped toward him. He pointed behind me. "They're coming." The entire forest filled with people. Hundreds of missing hikers, rangers, children, every one of them staring at me. The older version of myself stood at the front. He raised his hand. "Time to go home." I woke up the next morning inside my own bed. Sunlight came through the window. Everything looked normal. My phone was beside me. There were no missed calls, no blood, no forest. I almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare until I walked into the bathroom. Written across the mirror in condensation were 4 words. "You never left the mountain." I wiped them away. Then my reflection smiled before I did. It leaned toward the glass and whispered, "Tonight, we go back." And from somewhere beneath my house, far below the floorboards, I heard a little boy laughing. Story 8. I found a ranger cabin that wasn't on any map. And inside it, a man who had been dead for 19 years asked me why I was late. The call came from a remote section of the Appalachian backcountry after 2 hikers disappeared during a storm. Their last emergency transmission contained only 1 sentence. "There is a light between the trees, but nobody is inside the cabin." I was sent in before sunrise because the weather was getting worse and the trail was already becoming dangerous. 3 miles into the forest, I found their footprints. 4 sets. 2 hikers had gone in, but something else had been walking beside them. The strange footprints were barefoot and much smaller than an adult. They followed the hikers for almost half a mile before suddenly turning toward a wall of trees where no trail existed. I followed them. That's when I found the cabin. It was an old ranger station built from dark timber, surrounded by dead trees. There was no road, no trail, and no reason for a cabin to exist there. Smoke was coming from the chimney. I knocked. A man opened the door. He wore an old park ranger uniform. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his name badge read Ellis Ward. I knew that name immediately. Ranger Ellis Ward had disappeared during a winter rescue operation 19 years earlier. His body had never been found. I stared at him. He smiled. "You're late." I asked where the hikers were. He stepped aside. Inside. The cabin looked normal at first. A fire burned in the fireplace. 2 backpacks sat beside the wall. Wet boots were drying near the stove. Then I noticed the photographs. Hundreds of them covered every wall. Missing hikers, rangers, families, children. Every photograph showed the same cabin. I asked Ellis where we were. He looked at the window. "You're not in the forest anymore." I didn't understand. Then I noticed the clock. It was running backward. I asked him again about the hikers. He pointed toward a closed door. "They're sleeping." I opened it. The 2 hikers were lying on the floor, alive. Their eyes were open, but neither moved. One whispered, "Don't wake them." I asked who. He pointed toward the ceiling. Something heavy crawled above us. Slow footsteps moved across the roof. Ellis immediately put his finger to his lips. The footsteps stopped directly above my head. Then something scratched 3 times on the ceiling. Ellis whispered, "It knows you're here." I asked him what it was. He said, "The thing that keeps the cabin warm." Suddenly the fire went out. The room became freezing. The hikers sat upright at the same time. Their mouths opened, but Ellis spoke through them. "You came looking for them." I backed toward the door. Ellis grabbed my arm. "Don't leave after dark." I asked what happened after dark. He pointed toward the window. Outside stood dozens of people, rangers, hikers, children, all staring at the cabin. Their faces were completely expressionless. One of them raised a hand and waved. Ellis whispered, "They've been waiting for you." I asked how long. He looked at the clock. 19 years. I realized something was wrong. Ellis hadn't aged. He looked exactly like the photograph from his missing person file. I asked him why he was still alive. He smiled sadly. "I'm not." The cabin shook. Something struck the front door. Once. Twice. Then the entire door bent inward. Ellis grabbed an old shotgun and told me to get the hikers into the basement. I asked why. "Because it can't enter the basement." We dragged the hikers downstairs. The basement was filled with ranger equipment from different decades. Old radios, backpacks, boots, uniforms, hundreds of name tags. Some belonged to rangers who had disappeared recently. Others were from people missing for decades. On the wall was a list. At the bottom was today's date. Beside it was my name. I stared at it. "Ellis?" He didn't answer. The basement door slammed shut. We heard something entering the cabin above us. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor. Then a woman's voice called my name. My mother. She'd been dead for years. "Come upstairs." I covered my ears. The hikers began crying. Ellis whispered, "It copies voices." My mother's voice became angry. "You left me." Then my father's voice. "You promised." Then my own voice. "Open the door." I asked Ellis how to escape. He pointed to a tunnel behind the shelves. "Follow it until you see daylight." We entered the tunnel. It was narrow and covered in roots. After several minutes, we reached a wooden door. Ellis stopped. "Don't open it until I tell you." I asked why. He looked terrified. "Because the last person who opened it wasn't you." Then something grabbed him from behind. Ellis disappeared into the darkness. I pulled the door open. Daylight flooded my eyes. I stepped outside and found myself standing beside the original trail. My truck was still there. The hikers were beside me. I looked back. The cabin was gone. Only trees remained. We drove back to town and reported everything. The sheriff listened silently. Then he opened an old file. Inside was a photograph of Ellis Ward standing beside the same cabin. The date was 19 years earlier. On the back, someone had written, "Ranger Ward entered the cabin at 4:12 a.m. and never came out." I asked why nobody had found the cabin. The sheriff looked at me. "Because it only appears when someone is going to disappear." That night, I returned to the ranger station and tried to sleep. At 4:12 a.m., my radio turned on. Ellis Ward's voice came through the static. "You forgot something." I sat up. "What?" he whispered. "You left the door open." I looked toward my bedroom doorway. It was open. Beyond it was darkness. Then I saw the cabin. Not outside. Inside my house. The same wooden walls. The same fireplace. The same old photographs. Ellis stood beside the fire. The two hikers were sitting at the table, and behind them stood dozens of missing rangers. Ellis smiled. "You came back." I tried to run, but the hallway had disappeared. I was standing inside the cabin again. The door slammed shut behind me. Ellis looked at the clock. It was moving backward. "Don't worry," he said. "You won't be late next time." I asked what he meant. He pointed toward the wall. A new photograph had appeared. It showed me standing inside the cabin. Beneath it was tomorrow's date. Then another photograph appeared. This one showed an empty ranger station. My name badge was hanging on the wall. Ellis walked toward me and whispered, "The cabin doesn't kill people." He smiled. "It keeps them." And then the fire went out.